My mom gave my childhood room to my brother. 6 months later, she was sleeping on my couch. I found out about my childhood room on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was sitting in my apartment in downtown Portland, scrolling through my phone during my lunch break, when I saw the photos my brother posted on social media. New gaming setup. He'd captioned it with 3 pictures showing off his elaborate computer station, LED lights glowing purple and blue against walls I knew intimately. Those were my walls. The same pale yellow I'd chosen when I was 14. The same window where I used to sit and read on rainy afternoons. The same closet where I'd hidden my journals and kept my favorite clothes. My childhood bedroom had been transformed into my brother's gaming den, and nobody had bothered to tell me. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't that I needed the room. I was 27 years old, living 3 hours away, completely independent. I had my own apartment, my own life, my own space. But that room had been mine for 18 years. It held every memory of my adolescence, every moment of growth, every night I'd stayed up late studying or crying or dreaming about my future. And my mother had just erased it without a word. I called her immediately. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, waiting for her to answer. When she finally picked up, her voice was casual, cheerful even. She asked about my week like nothing was wrong. I asked her about the room, trying to keep my voice steady. She sighed, that particular sigh that meant she thought I was being dramatic. She told me my brother needed the space, that he was 23 and still living at home, that he needed somewhere to pursue his hobbies. She said my old room was just sitting empty anyway and it made sense to let him use it. I reminded her that I'd asked specifically multiple times if I could keep some things stored there. Photo albums, yearbooks, boxes of memories I didn't have space for in my small apartment. She told me she'd moved everything to the garage. When I asked if I could come get them, she said she'd actually donated most of it. She'd assumed I didn't want any of it since I hadn't come to get it myself. The boxes had been sitting in the garage for months, she said, taking up space they needed. She'd thrown away my memories like they were garbage. I tried to explain why this hurt, why it mattered that she hadn't asked me first, hadn't given me a chance to go through my own belongings. He cut me off. She said I was being selfish, that I'd moved away and started my own life, that I couldn't expect her to maintain a shrine to my childhood forever. She said my brother had always gotten the smaller bedroom, that he'd spent his whole life in my shadow, and it was time he got something that was truly his. That last part stung the most. My shadow. As if I'd somehow been favored, somehow been given more. I'd worked 2 jobs through college while my brother stayed home rent-free. I'd paid my own way through everything while my mother supplemented his income so he could work part-time and focus on his streaming hobby. I'd been independent since I was 18 while he, at 23, still had my mother doing his laundry and cooking his meals. But I was the one who'd been given too much, apparently. We argued for 20 minutes. I said things I'd been holding back for years. She said things that confirmed what I'd always suspected, that she valued my brother's comfort over my feelings, that she saw my independence as a reason to prioritize him. The conversation ended with her telling me I was being ridiculous and me hanging up before I said something I couldn't take back. I didn't speak to her for a month after that. She didn't reach out either. My brother posted more photos of his gaming setup, oblivious or uncaring about what it meant to me. My mother commented on all of them, proud and supportive, celebrating his hobby while my hurt feelings went unacknowledged. I threw myself into work. I was a project manager at a mid-sized tech company, and we were in the middle of a major product launch. The long hours were a blessing. They kept me busy, kept me from thinking too much about family dynamics I couldn't fix. I ate lunch at my desk, stayed late most evenings, volunteered for weekend work. My colleagues probably thought I was ambitious. Really, I just didn't want to go home to my empty apartment and think about how my mother had erased my childhood without a second thought. In April I got a promotion. More responsibility, better pay, a small team to manage. I was proud of myself, genuinely proud. I'd earned this through hard work and competence. I posted about it on social media, something I rarely did because I wanted to share this achievement with someone. My friends congratulated me. My coworkers liked the post. My mother never commented. My brother, meanwhile, had decided to pursue streaming full-time. He quit his part-time job at the electronics store, the one my mother had helped him get, and committed to building his online presence. My mother was supportive, telling him to follow his dreams, offering to cover his expenses while he got established. She posted about his decision on her own social media, talking about how proud she was that he was brave enough to pursue his passion. I wondered if she'd been that supportive when I'd told her I was moving to Portland for my career. I didn't think so. She'd been worried, cautious, telling me I was making a mistake leaving my hometown. But my brother's equally risky decision was bravery. The double standard was so obvious it would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. By May, I'd rebuilt my life around the absence of my family. I made new friends through work, joined a book club, started going to a climbing gym. I dated casually, nothing serious but enough to feel connected to other people. I created a life that felt full and meaningful without needing my mother's approval or my brother's acknowledgement. It was healthier, probably, this distance I'd created. But it was also lonely in ways I didn't like to admit. Then June arrived and everything changed. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice different than I'd ever heard it. Shaky, uncertain, almost small. She needed to talk to me, she said. Something had happened. Something bad. My mother's voice on the phone that Wednesday evening was barely recognizable. Gone was the confident, matter-of-fact tone she always used with me. Instead, she sounded fragile, almost frightened. She told me she needed to explain some things, that there were problems she hadn't mentioned to anyone. I sat down on my couch, bracing myself for whatever was coming. He started with my brother. His streaming career wasn't going well. He'd been at it full-time for 2 months and had barely gained any followers. The few donations he received weren't even covering his equipment costs. But he'd convinced her to invest in better cameras, a professional microphone, a green screen setup. She'd spent thousands of dollars supporting his dream, money she'd pulled from her savings account. Then she told me about her job. She'd been working as an administrative assistant at a dental office for 15 years, stable and reliable income. But the office had been bought out by a larger practice, and they'd let go of half the staff during the consolidation. She'd lost her job in April. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't even told my brother. She'd been pretending to go to work every day, sitting in coffee shops, in the library, sending out resumes and getting rejection after rejection. She was 56 years old in a job market that wanted younger workers who'd accept lower salaries. Every interview seemed promising until they saw her age, saw her decades of experience that translated to higher salary expectations. She'd been unemployed for 2 months and hadn't received a single job offer. Her savings were running out. The money she'd set aside for emergencies had been depleted, supporting my brother's equipment purchases and covering her own expenses while unemployed. She'd made the minimum payments on her credit cards, but the balances were climbing. She'd skipped her car insurance payment last month. She was behind on the mortgage. And then came the real crisis. My brother had gotten into an accident. Nothing serious, no injuries, but he'd been at fault and he didn't have insurance. The other driver was suing. The amount they were asking for was more than my mother made in a year back when she'd had a job. Her homeowner's insurance might cover some of it since my brother lived with her, but there would still be significant out-of-pocket costs. Legal fees alone were going to be devastating. She'd consulted with a bankruptcy attorney. The attorney had been honest with her. She would probably lose the house. The mortgage was already underwater, she owed more than it was worth, and with the lawsuit and her credit card debt, bankruptcy was the only realistic option. She'd have to sell, probably at a loss, and find somewhere else to live. I listened to all of this in stunned silence. My mother, who'd always been so proud of her financial stability, who'd lectured me about responsibility and planning for the future, had let everything fall apart in a matter of months. Part of me felt vindicated. She'd prioritized my brother over everything, including her own financial security, and now she was facing the consequences. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad and tired and uncertain about what any of this meant for me. She asked if she and my brother could stay with me temporarily while she figured things out. Just a few weeks, she promised. Just until she found a job and could afford first and last month's rent on an apartment. She had nowhere else to go. Her sister lived across the country and couldn't help. Her friends were all in similar financial situations, struggling themselves. I should have said no immediately. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to protect myself, to maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. This was the woman who'd thrown away my childhood memories, who'd erased my room without asking, who'd consistently chosen my brother's comfort over my feelings. Why should I upend my life to help her? But I couldn't say no. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the years of feeling like I came second, she was still my mother. And she was genuinely desperate in a way I'd never heard before. So I told her yes, but with conditions. 2 weeks maximum. They'd sleep on the couch and air mattress. They'd respect my space and my schedule. And my brother would need to find a job immediately, any job, to start contributing. She agreed to everything. He sounded relieved, grateful even. She said they'd drive up that weekend with whatever belongings they could fit in her car. The rest would go into storage, or more likely, would be sold or abandoned when she lost the house. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment, trying to process what I'd just agreed to. My mother and brother, the two people who'd made me feel invisible and unimportant for most of my life, were about to invade my carefully constructed sanctuary. The space I'd built to be entirely mine was about to become a temporary shelter for the family that had never made room for me. I looked around my apartment. It was small, just a 1-bedroom, but it was mine. I'd furnished it carefully over the years, chosen every piece with intention. The artwork on the walls was from local artists I'd discovered at Portland markets. The bookshelf was organized by genre and author. The kitchen had my favorite coffee maker and the set of dishes I'd saved up to buy. Everything reflected who I was, who I'd become without my family's influence. And in 3 days it would all be disrupted. I spent that weekend preparing. I cleaned obsessively, moved furniture to make space for the air mattress, bought extra towels and toiletries. I set ground rules in my head, boundaries I'd need to enforce. I reminded myself this was temporary, that 2 weeks would pass quickly, that I could survive anything for 2 weeks. Saturday evening I got a text from my mother. They were running late, wouldn't arrive until Sunday afternoon. Some issue with packing and the car being too full. I felt a flicker of irritation, the first of what I knew would be many over the coming weeks. They were already disrupting my plans before they'd even arrived. Sunday afternoon came and went. No mother, no brother, no text explaining the delay. I tried calling, got voicemail. I texted, got no response. By evening I was genuinely worried. Had something happened? Another accident? A breakdown on the highway? They finally arrived at 9 at night, 5 hours late, with no apology and no real explanation. Just vague mentions of traffic and needing to make stops. They unloaded bags and boxes from my mother's car, far more than should have been necessary for a 2-week stay. My brother carried in his gaming computer, his monitors, his expensive chair. He was bringing his streaming setup. For a 2-week stay. I realized then what I'd gotten myself into. This wasn't going to be 2 weeks. This was going to be much, much longer. And my mother had known that when she'd asked, had known I'd say no if she'd been honest about the timeline. The first night I barely slept. I could hear them in my living room, my brother setting up his equipment, my mother unpacking. I lay in my bed, staring at my ceiling, wondering how I'd let myself get manipulated into this situation. Wondering how long it would take before I couldn't stand it anymore. Wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The first week was worse than I'd imagined. My brother took over my living room completely, setting up his streaming equipment in the corner where my reading chair used to be. He streamed late into the night, his voice loud and animated as he played games and talked to the handful of people watching. I could hear every word through my bedroom wall. His schedule was backwards, sleeping until 2 in the afternoon, gaming until 4 in the morning. My mother made excuses for him, said he needed to stream when his audience was most active, said he was building something important. My mother, meanwhile, had taken over my kitchen. She cooked elaborate meals I didn't ask for, using ingredients I'd bought for myself, rearranging my cabinets to make room for things she'd brought from home. She left dishes in the sink, crumbs on the counters, her coffee cups on every surface. When I gently suggested she clean up after herself, she looked hurt and reminded me she was going through a difficult time. I started leaving for work earlier and staying later, anything to avoid being in my own apartment. I ate lunch out, grabbed dinner on the way home, sometimes sat in coffee shops just to have space that felt like mine. My coworkers noticed I seemed tired, distracted. I made vague excuses about family visiting, didn't mention that my sanctuary had been invaded. The 2-week mark came and went without discussion. My mother was still sending out resumes but hadn't gotten any interviews. My brother was still streaming to minimal viewership, making maybe $20 a week in donations. Neither of them mentioned leaving. Neither of them acknowledged that they'd overstayed the agreed timeline. I tried to bring it up in the 3rd week. I asked my mother as gently as I could what her plan was for finding a place. She got defensive immediately. She said she was doing everything she could, that the job market was impossible, that she couldn't afford rent anywhere without a job. She reminded me she was my mother, that family helped each other, that she'd sacrificed so much raising me. The guilt worked. I dropped the subject. My brother never looked for a job. Every time I suggested he apply somewhere, anywhere, he had excuses. He was building his brand, he couldn't work regular hours because of his streaming schedule. Retail work would drain his creative energy. My mother backed him up every time, telling me I didn't understand how hard he was working, how much potential he had. I watched my savings account slowly drain. My grocery bills doubled. The water bill tripled. The electricity bill was astronomical from my brother's equipment running constantly. When I asked them to contribute financially, my mother promised they would as soon as she got a job. My brother said his streaming income would pick up any day now. Neither of them ever gave me a single dollar. By the 4th week I was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, feeling anxious in my own home. I'd stopped having friends over because I was embarrassed by the situation. My apartment, which had always been my refuge, felt like a trap. I'd come home from work to find my mother watching television at full volume, my brother yelling into his microphone, their belongings spreading into every corner of every room. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late July. I'd had a difficult week at work. A project had gone wrong and I'd spent days managing the fallout. I came home exhausted, desperate for quiet, and found my brother hosting some kind of streaming event. He'd invited 3 of his online friends to participate remotely, and he was being louder than ever, practically screaming at his screen. My mother was cooking something that made the entire apartment smell like burnt onions. Every light was on, the television was blaring, and there was literally nowhere for me to exist peacefully in my own home. I walked into my bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time in years I cried. Not gentle tears, but the kind of crying that comes from deep exhaustion and accumulated hurt. I cried for the childhood room I'd lost, for the boundaries that had been trampled, for the life I'd built that had been invaded and disrupted. I cried because I'd been trying so hard to be good, to be helpful, to be the responsible daughter, and nobody appreciated it or even noticed. When I finally stopped crying, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. Something had to change, and since my mother and brother weren't going to change themselves, I had to force the issue. I spent the weekend researching options. I looked at rental assistance programs, job placement services, cheap apartments in surrounding areas. I put together a list of resources, practical steps my mother could take to get back on her feet. I also looked at my lease, confirmed what I already knew, that I had the legal right to ask my guests to leave with appropriate notice. Monday evening I sat them both down. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, tried to make it firm but compassionate. I told them this arrangement wasn't working, that they needed to make concrete plans to move out. I gave them 4 weeks until the end of August. I offered to help my mother with job applications, to review her resume, to practice interviews with her. I told my brother he needed to find employment immediately, that streaming couldn't be his only focus anymore. My mother's face went through several expressions. Shock, hurt, anger, then something colder. She told me I was being cruel, that I was abandoning family when they needed me most. She brought up everything she'd ever done for me, every sacrifice she'd made when I was growing up. She said she couldn't believe I'd turned out so selfish, so heartless. My brother barely looked up from his phone. He muttered something about me not understanding his career, then went back to his room, if you could call my living room his room. He didn't argue, didn't promise to change. He just dismissed me entirely. That night, lying in bed, I questioned everything. Was I being selfish? Was I abandoning them? Should I just accept this situation, sacrifice my own comfort and financial security for family? These were the questions my mother had trained me to ask myself, the guilt she'd cultivated in me my entire life. But I was also angry. Angry at being manipulated, angry at having my generosity exploited, angry at being made to feel guilty for setting reasonable boundaries. I'd given them a month rent-free in my small apartment. I'd fed them, absorbed their expenses, tolerated the disruption of my entire life. And somehow I was the villain for asking them to leave. I decided then that I wouldn't back down. For weeks, and then they had to go regardless of whether they'd found jobs or apartments or solutions. I couldn't save them, and I couldn't destroy myself trying. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the clearest. The next 4 weeks would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and self-preservation. But I was done being the person who always sacrificed herself for people who never appreciated it. I was done being invisible in my own life. The 4 weeks I'd given them felt both endless and too short. My mother spent the first week in a state of cold silence, communicating with me only when absolutely necessary. She made pointed comments about how some daughters actually cared about their families, how she'd never imagined I'd turn out so cold. She told me about friends whose children had welcomed them with open arms during hard times, never asking them to leave. The guilt trips were constant and calculated. My brother ignored the deadline entirely. He continued streaming on his usual schedule, ordering takeout with money I never saw him earn, treating my apartment like it was his permanent residence. When I reminded him he needed to find work, he'd nod absently and change the subject. He was waiting for me to back down, to extend the deadline, to cave under the pressure my mother was applying. I didn't cave. Instead, I started taking concrete steps. I contacted a tenant rights organization to understand my legal position. Technically, they were guests, not tenants, since they'd never paid rent and had no written agreement. I could ask them to leave, and if they refused, I could pursue legal eviction. I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but I needed to know my options. I also started rebuilding my boundaries in small ways. I bought a lock for my bedroom door and started keeping my laptop and important documents secured when I wasn't home. I created a separate shelf in the refrigerator for my food and labeled it clearly. I stopped buying groceries in bulk, only purchasing what I needed for myself. When my mother complained, I reminded her gently that I'd asked them to start contributing financially and they hadn't. In the second week, my mother finally started taking the deadline seriously. She applied to dozens of jobs, lowering her salary expectations, expanding her search radius. She got 2 interviews, both for positions that paid significantly less than her previous job. One rejected her immediately. The other wanted to do a second interview but kept rescheduling. The frustration was visible on her face, and despite everything, I felt sympathy for her. The job market was genuinely difficult, especially for someone her age. But sympathy didn't mean I was willing to extend the deadline indefinitely. I helped her look at apartments she could afford with unemployment benefits and potential part-time work. They were small in less desirable areas, nothing like the house she'd lost. She looked at the listings with barely concealed disgust, making comments about how far she'd fallen, how humiliating this all was. My brother, meanwhile, had a revelation in week 3. One of his streaming friends mentioned their workplace was hiring, a warehouse job with decent pay and benefits. It wasn't glamorous, it would mean giving up his streaming schedule, but it was stable income. I encouraged him to apply, trying to sound supportive rather than desperate. He actually did it, and to everyone's surprise, he got hired. He'd start the Monday after my deadline, working second shift. The job offer changed something in my mother. She suddenly became warmer toward me, thanking me for pushing my brother toward responsibility, saying maybe this had all been necessary for him to grow up. She conveniently forgot that she'd called me heartless just weeks earlier. She started talking about how proud she was that her children were both so independent and successful. With my brother's income, they could afford a small 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb halfway between Portland and our hometown. It wasn't ideal, but it was possible. My mother would continue job hunting while collecting unemployment. My brother would work and could stream on his days off if he still wanted to. They'd be poor, definitely struggling, but they'd survive. The day before the deadline, they finally started packing. My mother moved slowly, making a production of it, sighing heavily as she folded clothes and packed boxes. She commented repeatedly about how small the new apartment would be, how different from the house she'd owned, how hard it was to start over at her age. She was looking for sympathy, for me to feel guilty enough to let them stay longer. I stayed firm. I helped them pack, drove them to buy moving supplies, even offered to help them move into their new place. But I didn't extend the deadline. August 31st arrived and they had to be out. That was non-negotiable. On moving day, my brother was surprisingly efficient. He loaded his equipment carefully, making multiple trips to my mother's car. He didn't complain, didn't make dramatic statements. He just did the work. I think the warehouse job had already started changing his perspective, showing him what actual work felt like. My mother was different. She moved slowly, kept stopping to rest, made sure I saw how difficult this was for her. She told me she hoped I never had to experience what she was going through, being forced out by family when she needed help most. She said she'd remember this, the way I'd prioritized my own comfort over her well-being. The words stung even though I knew they were manipulative. When their car was finally packed, when every bag and box had been loaded, my mother stood in my doorway one last time. She looked around my apartment at the space that would finally be mine again, and her expression was complicated. Hurt, angry, but also something else. Maybe a grudging respect, maybe recognition that I'd held a boundary she'd never expected me to maintain. She told me she hoped I was happy, that I had what I wanted. I almost responded defensively, almost explained again why this was necessary. But I didn't. I just hugged her, told her I loved her, and said I hoped the new apartment worked out well. He didn't hug me back, not really. Just stood stiffly in my arms for a moment before pulling away. My brother gave me an awkward wave from the car. No hug, no words, just acknowledgement that this chapter was ending. I watched them drive away, my mother's car loaded down with everything they owned, heading toward an uncertain future in a small apartment neither of them wanted. I walked back into my apartment and closed the door. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. For 2 months, this space had been filled with noise and people and chaos. Now it was just mine again. I stood in my living room, looking at the empty corner where my brother's gaming setup had been, at the clean kitchen counters, at the couch that was finally just a couch again. I should have felt victorious. I'd held my boundary, reclaimed my space, proved I couldn't be manipulated. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired and sad and uncertain about what any of this meant for my relationship with my family going forward. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. I deep cleaned every surface, rearranged my furniture back to how I liked it, restocked my kitchen with food I actually wanted to eat. I started sleeping better, stopped feeling anxious when I came home from work. My apartment became my sanctuary again. My mother and I texted occasionally. Brief updates, nothing substantial. She'd found a part-time job at a grocery store, not what she wanted, but it was income. My brother was adjusting to warehouse work, still streaming occasionally but much less seriously. They were surviving, learning to live within their reduced means. I visited them once, 6 weeks after they'd moved out. The apartment was small and dark, nothing like the house my mother had been so proud of. But it was clean and organized and they seemed to be managing. My mother was polite but distant. My brother was tired from work but seemed more grounded somehow. We had dinner together, conversations stilted and careful, all of us avoiding the topics that mattered most. As I drove back to Portland that evening, I thought about everything that had happened. About the childhood room I'd lost, about the 2 months of invasion, about the boundary I'd held despite immense pressure. I thought about family and obligation and the difference between helping someone and letting them destroy you. I didn't regret asking them to leave. But I also recognized the cost of that decision, the way it had permanently altered our relationship. We'd never be close again, not the way some families are. Too much had been said, too much resentment had built up on both sides. But I had my life back. My space, my peace, my ability to exist on my own terms. And maybe that was worth the cost. Maybe setting boundaries, even when they hurt, even when they made me the villain in someone else's story, was the only way to survive. 6 months after my mother had given away my childhood room, 6 months after everything had fallen apart for her, I'd learned something crucial. I couldn't fix my family's problems. I couldn't sacrifice myself endlessly in hopes of earning love or approval that might never come. All I could do was protect my own well-being and hope that eventually, maybe, we'd find a way to relate to each other that didn't require me to disappear. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot as the sun was setting, painting the Portland sky in shades of orange and pink. I walked up to my door, unlocked it, and stepped into my quiet, empty, perfectly peaceful home. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. The tables had turned, just not in the way I'd expected. Not with triumph or revenge or vindication. Just with the quiet recognition that I'd survived, that I'd protected myself, that I'd finally learned to put my own oxygen mask on first. And that was enough.